Every now and then, a fighter will come on the scene and they just pass the eye test. There's just something about them that screams future world champion, and ERROL Spence was that fighter. When he arrived on the professional scene back in 2012, it was clear that Spence was no ordinary prospect. It wasn't anything in particular that made him stand out from the rest, he was just great at everything. A truly well-rounded boxer who did the basic fundamentals extremely well. But after his crushing defeat to Terence Crawford in 2023, Spence has been absent from the ring with no clear sign of a comeback. It raises the question, how good was ERROL, the true Spence, actually? Born in 1990 in Long Island, New York, Spence found the sport of boxing fairly late at 15 years old. Regardless, Spence would become an elite-level amateur, winning the US National Golden Gloves in 2009 and winning 3 consecutive National Amateur Welterweight Championships. After so much success on the national scene, Spence was picked to represent his country of the United States of America at the London 2012 Olympics. Spence would get to the quarterfinals, but he would lose out to Russia's Andrei Zankovoy. Following the Olympics, Spence retired from the amateurs with a final record of 135 wins and 12 defeats. Spence would turn over to the professional game later in the year and he would blitz through his early opposition, stopping his first 8 opponents. One of the most notable moments of Spence's early professional career was his infamous spar with Floyd Mayweather. Spence was still a novice with just a handful of professional fights under his belt, but according to those who were present at the time, Spence gave Mayweather a hard spar. Now, most fighters would be intimidated to spar with Floyd, but Spence showed he had a mentality different to most. He went into one of the most intimidating gyms in the world and held his own. That just shows that Spence had an extreme level of self-confidence early on, and it's what made him stand out amongst the many prospects in the sport. At the end of 2014, Spence was 15-0 and hadn't really put a foot wrong in the ring. It was now time for him to get a serious test in his career, and that came in the form of 21-1 tough Colombian Samuel Vargas. From the opening bell, Spence landed well on Vargas with good combinations. The Colombian showed good aggression, but it didn't come to anything as Spence was too accurate and sharp, and he caught Vargas's punches before landing big counters. Spence was breaking Vargas down. He picked him apart with powerful and precise punches from body to head, and in round 4, after plenty of punishment, the referee had finally seen enough and stopped the fight. It was a destructive performance from Spence against a solid opponent. On September 11th, 2015, Spence would step up the levels further and take on former IBO welterweight champion Chris Van Heerden. Spence broke down Van Heerden in a patient and poised display. Spence, like he normally does, focused on the body and he found plenty of success there, landing some brutal shots while also mixing it up with sharp jabs and uppercuts. In round 7, Spence sent Heerden down to the canvas, which was the first time he had ever been knocked down in his career. Van Heerden got back to his feet, but he would be down again after Spence brutalized him with a body shot. The fight wouldn't last much longer, as in the following round the referee finally saw enough and stopped the fight. It was another clinical performance from Spence where he broke down yet another opponent. Spence's success didn't go unnoticed and he had been named Prospect of the Year for 2015. Although he was given the title as Prospect, it was clear that Spence had progressed to a fully fledged welterweight contender, and his next fight would solidify that status. On the 16th of April 2016 in the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, ERROL Spence would have his biggest fight to date against former WBO welterweight champion of the world, Chris Algieri. On paper, this was meant to be Spence's biggest test to date, but on the night, it was a one-sided beatdown. Algieri had nothing in his arsenal to make this fight competitive and trouble Spence in any way. In the 4th round, Spence caught Algieri with a solid left hand and dropped him. Algieri got to his feet and battled back with Spence, but he just couldn't put together any clean or effective shots, while Spence was creating constant angles, showing great movement and landing the better shots. In round 5, Algieri was down again from another sharp and powerful left hand. Algieri got up again, but Spence would soon end the fight for good, unleashing fast and relentless combinations, ending with a left hand that put Algieri down for the 3rd time, and the fight was over. That meant that Spence became the first person to stop Algieri in his pro career. Later in the same year, Spence would take on veteran Leonard Bundu. Bundu was 41 years old, but he was very tough and a very game fighter who came to win. Once Spence figured out Bundu, he put on a punch-perfect performance. He used his superior reach effectively and picked his shots well, using jabs, uppercuts and straight shots to pick Bundu apart. Spence was just too accurate and powerful for his challenger, and he would eventually knock Bondu down in round 6 with a short left uppercut. Spence showed great killer instinct once Bondu got back up, and he rendered him unconscious with a powerful short right hook. Spence became only the second fighter to defeat Bondu and the first to knock him out. After the fight, Spence made it clear that he wanted a world title shot next, and he called out IBF World Welterweight Champion Kell Brook. On March 22nd, 2017, it was announced that Errol would travel to England to take on Brook in his home city of Sheffield for the IBF World Welterweight Championship. In front of 27,000 of Brook's fans, Spence showed that the hype was justified. Despite being in hostile territory, Spence looked ultra calm and composed, and it didn't take long for him to find his range and let off his trademark body shots. He was throwing combinations to head and body and wearing the champion down. Brook did well to counterpunch with his left hand, landing on several occasions, but Spence proved to be the more technically superior fighter. In the 10th round, Spence put together some heavy combinations to drop Brook. At this point in the fight, Brook's eye looked horrendous. He was blinking constantly, and it was just clear that serious damage had been caused to it. However, Brook showed lots of heart to fight on, but in round 11, the damage just became too much, and he decided to take a knee to prevent further damage being done to his eye. Brook refused to get up, and the fight was over. It was the correct decision from Brook because it turned out that he actually suffered a broken orbital bone during the fight. Spence was now the new IBF champion of the world. Spence's first defense of his world title would come against former IBF world champion Lamont Peterson. Spence broke down Peterson mentally and physically. In the 5th round, Spence dropped Peterson with a left hand. Peterson beat the count but looked unsteady. He managed to survive the rest of the round and went on in the following round to try his best to battle with Spence, but he was just getting punished in there. Spence was dismantling him with punches from all different angles and showcasing his elite body punching. Peterson's face was looking battered and bruised. He didn't show that he could change the outcome of the fight, and eventually his trainer saw enough and called the fight off. For me, this was easily one of Spence's best performances of his entire career. It was just a great showcase of Spence's body punching and his ability to break down an opponent. After obliterating undefeated Mexican contender Carlos Ocampo in just one round, Spence would take on former 4-weight world champion Mikey Garcia. Garcia dared to be great by vacating his lightweight world title and moving up multiple weight classes to take on Spence, but he would be totally outclassed in his first loss of his entire career. Spence did what he needed to do. He used his height and reach well and outboxed Garcia. Garcia just couldn't get into the fight at all. It was just a very uninspiring performance. Spence was so dominant that the fight just looked like a glorified spar. It was a very straightforward unanimous decision victory for Spence, and there isn't really much else to say other than I'm surprised it went the distance. At the back end of 2019, Spence would take on 2-time welterweight world champion Sean Porter in a unification fight with the IBF and WBC welterweight titles on the line. Both men put on a fantastic performance in a back and forth fight. Porter fought very aggressively, and his awkward style presented an interesting puzzle for Spence to solve. His superior work rate and relentless aggression was giving Spence plenty of problems throughout the fight, but Spence was edging most of the rounds in my opinion by landing the more accurate and effective shots. In round 11, Spence caught Porter with a short left hook, which made Porter drop his glove to the canvas, which scored the only knockdown in the fight. Porter remained on his feet and waited for the referee's 8 count to finish before getting back into the fight. The two men engaged in an explosive finish to the fight in the final round, and after 12 rounds had concluded, Spence was given a split decision victory. It was a competitive and close fight, but the cleaner and more effective work throughout the fight came from Spence, and he deserved to win in my opinion. 3 weeks after his win over Porter, in the early hours of October the 10th, 2019, Spence was involved in a horrific high-speed crash while not wearing a seatbelt. His Ferrari flipped multiple times and he was thrown violently from it, and Spence was found on concrete, and by some miracle, he didn't just survive, he was only diagnosed with a fractured jaw, a concussion, facial lacerations, and some damaged teeth. Honestly, the crash looked like something out of Formula 1. It was incredibly violent, and like I said, it was an absolute miracle that Spence is alive today. Understandably, there was a lot of doubt on whether Spence will ever fight again. Even his trainer Derek James questioned if he could ever truly recover. However, Spence's story in boxing wouldn't end after that crash, and instead he would return to the ring on December the 5th, 2020, against former 2-weight world champion Danny Garcia. Despite nearly losing his life and dealing with all the trauma that would come from such a horrific ordeal, Spence honestly looked back to his best and totally outclassed Garcia. He put on a fantastic boxing display, using his jab to dictate the majority of the fight. Garcia's well-known power was unable to hurt Spence and test his chin. Spence's timing and power nullified Garcia's offense, and his southpaw jab was causing swelling on the left eye of Garcia. After 12 rounds, Spence would win by unanimous decision, and just to think what Spence went through prior to this fight, this was truly an incredible performance and showed that he was still the fighter he was before the crash. On May 21st, 2021, the 8-division world champion Manny Pacquiao announced on his social media that he and Spence would meet in the ring on August 21st in Las Vegas. Contracts were signed and the venue was booked. However, on August 10th, Spence was forced to pull out after suffering a retinal tear to his left eye. He was replaced by WBA champion Yordenis Ugas. After successfully defending his title against Pacquiao, Ugas petitioned the WBA for a special permit to bypass his mandatory challenger and face Spence in a unification fight. Ugas' mandatory challenger agreed to step aside to allow for the Spence fight to happen, and so Spence vs Ugas was officially announced for April 16th, 2022. Just like after the crash where many people were questioning whether Spence would ever fully recover, many critics were wanting to see if Spence had recovered from his detached retina, which he suffered just months prior to this fight with Ugas. Spence more than answered his critics and outclassed the Cuban champion. Spence just overwhelmed Ugas. He was creating constant angles with his punches, coming in and out of range well, and he targeted every area of Ugas from body to head and to the sides. It was a typical Spence performance and he broke down Ugas. The only real trouble Spence had was in the 6th round where a bizarre moment occurred where Ugas landed a right hand that knocked Spence's mouthpiece out. Instead of fighting back like you're supposed to do, Spence decided to look for his mouthpiece on the canvas, and while he tried to find his mouthpiece, Ugas landed a huge right hand and Spence looked hurt and vulnerable for the first time in the fight. But in another bizarre turn of events, instead of jumping on Spence, who was clearly hurt, Ugas decided not to and instead basically allowed Spence to recover. Spence rebounded in the next round and punished Ugas. By the 10th round, Ugas' eye was completely closed and he clearly couldn't continue as he was unable to see. The ringside physician took a look at Ugas' eye and decided to stop the fight. Spence had now captured the WBA welterweight title and unified his IBF and WBC titles. After years of speculation, one of the most anticipated fights in recent years was finally confirmed. On May 25th, 2023, it was officially announced that ERROL Spence Jr. would take on Terence "Bud" Crawford for the undisputed welterweight titles on July 29th, 2023. In what was in most people's eyes a 50-50 matchup, this fight further proved that styles make fights. Crawford dismantled Spence, flooring him 3 times and eventually stopping him in round 9. From the opening bell, Crawford was in total control. In round 2, Crawford countered Spence with a perfectly timed right hand, which dropped Spence for the first time in his entire career. Crawford was beating Spence to the punch and using his world-class timing, counter-punching, and sense of range to dominate Spence. In round 7, Spence had Crawford onto the ropes and was unloading a combination, but was caught once again with a right hand from Crawford, which dropped him. Later in the round, Crawford landed his right hook once again, which dropped Spence for the 3rd time. Spence bravely fought on, but he was battered and bruised, and in round 9, Crawford unloaded a lot of unanswered shots and the referee would jump in and put Spence out of his misery. Following this devastating defeat, Spence has yet to return to the ring, and in April of 2024, Spence and his longtime trainer Derek James formally parted ways when James filed a lawsuit against Spence seeking unpaid money from their time working together. James is seeking $5 million in damages and the case is still going on today. Now of course ERROL Spence hasn't officially retired, he is still 35 years old, and considering Crawford just became an undisputed super middleweight champion at 37, it's not over for Spence by any means, but it's just not clear if he's ever going to come back. So as of right now, his record stands at 28 wins, just 1 defeat, capturing the WBA, WBC, IBF welterweight titles to become a unified champion. So how good was ERROL the true Spence actually? As I said at the start of the video, Spence is a great all-round boxer. He doesn't have any glaring flaws, but he also doesn't have that one attribute that stands out and makes him great. He's a jack of all trades who mastered the basic fundamentals of boxing. At his peak, he was one of the very best 147 fighters in the world, and I think a lot of fans have forgotten how truly elite Spence was. Just like other sports fans, boxing fans can be some of the most fickle people you'll ever see. Just one loss is all it takes for some fans to call a fighter overrated, and that's what happened to Spence. After his loss against Crawford, I saw people immediately saying he was a hype job all along, and that he was found out. This revisionist history is a common thing for fans to do after a fighter loses for the first time. Just you watch when Moses Atalma or Abdullah Mason take their first L, fans will immediately say that they were overhyped. It's just a strange mentality that some fans have, and it totally ignores the fact that these fighters are great despite losing. Losses will occur if you fight the very best, it's just part of the sport, it's part of any sport. And Spence lost to one of the greatest fighters to ever live, so there's no shame in that. I just hope Spence does come back to the sport because he is a great addition to the welterweight division, or any division he chooses to compete at. Whether he's the same fighter again, who knows? I mean, that loss against Crawford was a brutal beating, but he's come back from worse, as we know. So let me know what you make of Errol the Truth Spence in the comments below. Do you think we'll ever see him back in the ring? And as always, thanks very much for watching.